Hello, I'm Meg King, Director of the Wilson Center Science and Technology Innovation Program. This session is focused on the role of research and data in effective public management. Why, in the 21st century, with a variety of advanced technology available, are governments and public organizations without evidence? Banks wouldn't lend money without data to support whether a loan could be. A farmer wouldn't waste time and resources a field of corn if no one will buy it. In addition to making better decisions, data can help solve problems, understand performance, improve processes, and understand customers. Our two speakers today will address how evidence is used today in public management in Africa, how it can be used in the future, and identify challenges and opportunities. Diana Warira is a development communications specialist with 12 years experience in the field. She's currently a policy manager at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, managing JPAL's Gender and Economic Agency Initiative in East Africa, and is based at Innovations for Poverty Action, Kenya. Diana works with governments and non-state actors in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, relationships to support the generation, synthesis, and use of evidence to inform public policies on women's work. Prior to joining JPAL and IPA, Diana worked in various roles in communications and policy engagement at Africa-based think tanks, including the African Institute for Development Policy and the African Population and Health Research Center. Important of the International Center for Scholars, Southern for Peacebuilding Program, and a member of various professional associations, including the Africa Evidence Network and the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, among others. She is a strong advocate for evidence-informed decision-making in Africa and is the 2021 winner of the Africa Evidence Leadership Award. Mr. Lontum Shea, known as Shea, Nchaze, is a doctoral student in public policy at Oregon State University, where he focuses on international development. He worked for the budget division of the Cameroon Ministry of Finance as a statistical analyst. He has also served as a statistics consultant for several policy initiatives with the Nfuku Policy Institute in Cameroon, where he conducted a nationwide public opinion to democracy, good governance, and the rule of Accountability Lab Liberia, where he conducted the baseline survey for the Community Justice Teams project. Shea is an alumnus of the YALI West Africa Regional Leadership Center and a 2017 mentor. He holds data science certifications from the Duke University and Johns Hopkins University, as well as a science degree in economics from the University of Buea in Cameroon. Welcome to Diana. Will you start with some comments?
Thank you, Meg. So in my remarks, I'm going to cover these three areas: the current opportunity, early success, and what's next in the use of evidence in public management. So the opportunity, one may ask, why does evidence matter in public management? Our world today is struggling with an ever-growing sea of problems, be it public health threats and disease. For instance, we have COVID-19 right now, extreme poverty, and so forth. But governments have limited resources. So how do you decide what is the best investment to address these challenges with limited resources? So evidence helps policymakers make these decisions and also determine which programs are most cost-effective, have the greatest impact with potential for scale-up, and which ones are not working as intended and should be shut down. It also helps in improving existing programs. So evidence overall helps policymakers choose the best policy options among several. Ultimately, the option that will deliver public goods to citizens in the fastest and best way possible. So Africa has actually come a long way in evidence use in public management compared to 3 decades ago. And there's a lot of evidence being generated by governments and non-state actors. And this is contributing to shaping service delivery. And technology is also reducing the cost of collecting data, and data is being generated nearly every day across different citizens' points of engagement. So when we talk about early success, what's going well? So there's a lot going on well, both on the supply and demand side of the evidence to policy ecosystem, but I'm only going to highlight a few of these. So on the supply side, there are brilliant minds in Africa generating and delivering quality evidence to decision makers. We have several universities, think tanks, etc. And we also have a wide range of evidence types relevant for decision making, e.g. evidence from impact evaluations, such as the type that JPAL generates, routine monitoring and evaluation, scenario modeling, data from surveillance and observatories, and so forth. What about on the demand side? We have conversations about evidence use among decision makers in government, and these are becoming more mainstream. For instance, in the COVID crisis, most governments are continuously using evidence to inform COVID response as much as it's evolving. And there are also structures within our government institutions to facilitate evidence use. We've seen governments where they have research departments or directorates with policy and research staff. And decision makers are also joining evidence-oriented groups, e.g. evidence caucuses. And when we think about the challenges, on the supply side, some of these are already known to us, and I'll just mention them by passing, such as the timeliness and relevance of evidence, translation and communication, but I'm going to focus on relationships and silos approach. When we think about relationships, unfortunately, most researchers and evidence advocates have not learned the art of building strong relationships with government decision makers. So the two communities paradigm still prevails with policymakers on the one side and researchers and other intermediaries on the other side. So policymakers are not going to be able to share with you policy windows or current challenges their departments may be facing unless you build strong trusting relationships with mutual benefit. And you also need strong allies within government. So when you think about the silos approach, there are so many voices currently in the evidence to policy space. They all want to be heard, but most work in silos, resulting in reduced impact in the policy space as decision makers can only pay attention to so much. What about on the demand side? So we have often limited capacity with government research and policy departments in terms of synthesis and applying evidence in decision making. Most of these teams are understaffed and underfunded, and sometimes have to rely on funding actors. And we know that funding from non-state actors also means that sometimes research priorities are donor-driven, which has its shortcomings. And others include competing priorities, data gaps, etc. Now that we know all these things, what next? So in terms of thinking about potential solutions, one cross-cutting one across supply and demand is building networks that help break these silos and build sustainable relationships. What about governments? What can they do? So number one, resource allocation for evidence use. Then investing in capacity building for decision makers and their staff, establishing institutional frameworks to enhance the institutionalization of evidence-informed decision making, as well as establishing some mechanisms for innovation, such as embedded labs, where decision makers are able to test solutions in-house, and also greater investment in administrative data, so the collection and management, as well as interagency data sharing. What about evidence to policy organizations? They need to design and build strong partnerships with decision makers, and remembering that these efforts take time and different approaches are needed for different types of decision makers according to their evidence needs. And closely related to that is investing in formalizing long-term relationships, because when you have long-term relationships, you're able to respond quickly to policy windows and be more aware of which kind of evidence is going to be useful. And finally, on that point, also rapid response mechanisms to be able to provide evidence to decision makers on shorter timelines. And this addresses the issue of timeliness and relevance that I mentioned earlier. So JPAL is working across these different facets. We are investing in generating policy relevant evidence through randomized evaluations. And if I can quickly mention that evaluations are a great learning tool and not just an accountability mechanism to highlight challenges, we are investing in synthesis and distilling our lessons for governments. We also provide funding and technical assistance, as well as strengthen capacities through trainings on how to conduct randomized evaluations. And finally, we also invest in innovation to strengthen evidence use in governments. For instance, we have initiatives on admin data. We have an innovation called the Innovations in Data and Experiments for Action. Labs where we test solutions. For instance, we have one initiative called the Morocco Employment Lab and several more that I can talk about later. So overall, when we think about how to build a culture of evidence using Africa, I would say we need to invest in long-standing, genuine relationships, as I talked earlier, and be there for the long haul, and also embrace a participatory approach in generating policy-relevant evidence, what we are calling co-creation with decision makers, and be sure that this is truly participatory, and you invest in trusting, mutually beneficial relationships so that you can co-design solutions with decision makers. Thank you very much.
Diana. Shay?
Okay, thank you very much, the moderator, fellow speaker, and our dear participants. So welcome to this session on the role of data and research in effective public management. Let me begin my remarks by sharing a brief anecdote. So I spent 9 years working in the policy space before enrolling for doctoral studies. I worked with the Ministry of Finance, but I also spent a lot of time working with policy institutions in the private sector, especially those whose activities are facing accountability, governance, and democracy issues. So when I first came to grad school early this year, I faced the inevitable difficulties that you would face if you stay out of school for so long. And I spent so much time searching for explanations for why I faced those difficulties. So one day in a conversation with one of my professors, I remarked that perhaps I found a lot of difficulties because I've spent so many years performing analysis and writing memos for policymakers to take action. And I feel it is a demotion for me to start doing the same thing now for professors to give me grades. So this was an interesting conversation, but he urged me to see this as an opportunity to be more effective in creating impact, like take this as a chance to create even bigger impact in the future. So this analysis is simplistic, but I think it points to a larger ethic about working for the greater good. And this idea of working for the greater good is summarized for me more succinctly in the Code of Ethics of the American Society for Public Administration. And it says to promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service for oneself. Now, you agree with me that even our personal interests are hardly easy for us to identify and promote. Sometimes the things we really want are hardly the things we need. We even conflate our desires in the short term for our interests in the long term. I guess this happens a lot in our lives. And so the way to think about it is, if identifying what our personal interests are not so easy, it follows that identifying those of the public will be even more challenging, let alone the optimal strategies for meeting them. And this is where research and data have a major role to play. Now, let me pause here and clarify two important issues. The first is, it is true that politicians generally come to power with a policy blueprint in the form of a manifesto. To the extent that the election represents an approval of that manifesto, we all can agree that they have a legitimate interest to pursue it. And so I guess this is more about political knowledge that is actually part of the knowledge repertoire in every policy environment. So that is why I see the role of research and data as informing the policy process and not necessarily determining it. So my advocacy for evidence-based policy making should not be construed to imply that our democracy should be replaced by some form of technocracy. Also, my advocacy for research and data in the policy process does not suggest that research-based knowledge should take precedence over other forms of knowledge. So I talked, for instance, about the type of political knowledge that goes into a manifesto, but you can also think about professional knowledge. You can also think about experiential knowledge. These are important parts of the knowledge repertoire in every policy space. So my advocacy for research is rather a recognition of the enormous potential that we forfeit when we ignore the role that research-based knowledge can play in our policy landscape. Research provides us the means to understand the issues we seek to address thoroughly, but also helps us to identify the appropriate policy response, especially when competing policy needs call for our resources and capabilities, as my colleague already mentioned. Unfortunately, in Africa generally, and I can say so with some level of confidence because I have lived, worked, and studied in a number of African countries. But even more, especially in my country, Cameroon, there remains a lot of challenges to integrating research-driven evidence into our policy-making process. Now, these challenges are many, and they affect different countries to different degrees, but I'll outline the following ones. So the first is the problem of information gaps, in which policymakers are not aware of relevant evidence that is already available in the research community, like in our universities, in our think tanks, and even public research and data collection and management agencies. A lot of time, policymakers are even not aware that there is this evidence that they can leverage for the policy process. We also have the problem of urgency, and that is where we don't have proper mechanisms for anticipating problems. And so available evidence cannot be integrated into the response. So some will refer to this as a limited capacity for exploration. This is one that the COVID pandemic really laid bare for the entire world, but to which developing countries are even more vulnerable as they get more and more coupled into the global economy. Now, another challenge I will talk about now is that of political expediency, where political actors are incentivized to serve parochial interests rather than the interests of the general public. So, I mean, like the fact that there is political know-how doesn't necessarily mean it is actually leveraged and used benevolently. Lots of times, it actually goes to serve parochial purposes. And this is particularly troublesome in countries where politics is practiced along some sectarial lines like religious, tribal, racial, etc. And of course, there is the perennial problem that plagues social science in general, but even has more significance for policy-facing research. And that is the problem of generalizability. Results of social science research, including that from experimental designs, can be very, very context specific. And so we can hardly tell if scaling up a program that works in one place or replicating it in another setting will yield the same results. I think this is something that my fellow speaker from the Policy Action Lab can actually throw more light on, at least I've spent more time in that domain. Now, I don't like telling grim stories. As a policy practitioner and student, I only identify problems so that I can address them. So the challenges that I described above are by no means unsurmountable. To increase the uptake of evidence by public institutions in the continent, I would recommend the following solutions. Firstly, we need to create in-house research units in public agencies beyond the statistics departments that we already have. And the aim is that this should synthesize and translate research results and statistics into policy documents depending on the agency's mission and purpose. We also need to increase partnerships between public agencies and relevant centers of knowledge production. like policy think tanks, research centers, and universities. This will enable them to share results, research tools, best practices, and even provide peer review based on sectoral knowledge, because we realize that a lot of times information exchange has to occur between agencies that have specialized knowledge. And this can be a particular problem, a bigger problem, especially with the siloing that my fellow speaker already mentioned in our research space today. And finally, believe me, this is not a trivial matter. We need to improve the technical capacity of policymakers to appreciate and use evidence in decision making. I cannot count how often my superiors have requested information from me and yet got lost in the details I provided for them, hoping that these were necessary for them to make the best decisions. This problem is rooted in a wider problem concerning the way our public personnel roles are designed. And especially in most French-speaking countries that inherited a colonial system in which people meant for the public service were generally trained in specialist institutions, the general called the grands écoles. Now here, they overemphasize operational performance to the detriment of the type of flexibility that we actually need in order to address the type of problems today. So this constrains our ability to recruit and retain the type of flexible talent that is necessary to deal with the type of wicked problems that cry for solutions today. I will end my remarks here, hoping for the opportunity to exchange ideas with you all later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. Thank you, Diana. A number of really good. So I'll start with two of my own, and then I'll go to. We can ask questions all day. I'm so excited about this. So one thing that I mentioned, which I find fascinating and really, is while we're talking about data and we're talking about technological capacity to collect and analyze that data, one of the most important both opportunities and challenges involved. You mentioned relationships, Diana, and both the information gap often there, but we just haven't figured out how to collect humans. So can you both address that with some operational examples from your own experience? How continent to address that, and what going forward?
Speaking, sorry.
That's okay. Shay, can you?
Okay, I'm sorry I didn't hear the question well. A message coming from the board distracted me.
Sure. So the question is, you both mentioned why humans matter and the data and evidence, the information gap, Shay. And I just wondered if you and I could talk about examples where that or that relationship problem in Diana's case.
So, okay, if I will go first, I think in my case, I have generally been more successful with that, with my activities in the private sector. But I think part of it, as I already mentioned about the capacity of our public services, I think part of it is that most private sector agencies, including those that are facing the public policy space, are already inclined with the capacity to make use of evidence. So I worked on this project in Liberia. It's called the Community Justice Teams Project. The idea is to help mediate conflict in highly transient communities where they don't have the type of cultural institutions that most other communities use to seek redress, especially when it comes to justice issues. So so I went there when this project was ongoing, and we worked together to develop a scheme for training those who actually act as mediators, like guiding the like linking community members to the formal justice systems, and that for formal justice system, and that will be the police, the courts. So the aim is to like alleviate conflicts at the community level, and then only channel them to this system if they get beyond the capacity of the mediators, or if they, especially if there are criminal issues that local communities are not empowered to address on their own. I guess this is a classic case in which we actually leverage evidence from past projects and then prescribed solutions for the future, and we found from outcomes that we collected later, it was not the classic randomized control trial, but we tracked outcomes and realized that this really these interventions really improved both community relationships with the formal justice system, but also helped alleviate immediate crisis at the community level. So I guess this is a classic case in which we really use evidence gathered from the field to solve societal problems very well. But my success in this has largely been in the private sector. I mean, I can talk about other examples, but not as much in the public sector.
Thank you, Shay.
Thank you, Shay, for that. So for me, I can give one example from the experience of my colleagues while at the African Institute for Development Policy, that's AFIDEP, and it's actually one of my favorite examples of what relationships can do in terms of enhancing the use of evidence in public policy. So I was able to witness the close relationships between researchers at AFIDEP and other researchers within Malawi surrounding the generation of evidence around Malawi's potential to harness a demographic dividend. And I was able to see that journey as part of the communications and policy engagement team, and how the evidence from that study was able to finally get into the Malawi Growth and Development Strategy 3. So actually the policy recommendations from that study have fed into the health and population pillar of the Malawi Growth and Development Strategy 3. So it's a very nice, sort of neat, so to speak, pathway and seeing sustained engagement with decision makers in Malawi, from thinking through how do you define the situations around Malawi's potential to harness a demographic dividend, going through a period of generating the evidence and iterating on the findings and the framing of the issues coming through, and finally those findings being able to facilitate the framing of that important country strategy document. And closer home, I can just quickly mention that in terms of being able to leverage policy windows through close relationships with policymakers, I'll talk about like the National Council for Population and Development, NCPD, who are actually currently hosting what they're calling the National Leaders Conference to finalize the Kenya population policy. And we've been able to leverage this policy window to feed evidence into conversations around the review of the Kenya population policy. So this is an ongoing process. It's not finalized yet, but we wouldn't have known about this policy window if we didn't have a very close and mutually beneficial relationship with policymakers at the National Council for Population and Development.
One of our audience plays well on this part of the conversation. What can young people do to fill data gaps and ensure their government representatives are well informed? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. What can young people do to fill their data gaps? All right. I could start with a perspective of leveraging the opportunities within our universities and colleges. I think we've seen some improvements in research training within universities. I know there's a lot to be done, but if young people are able to step forward and urge their universities and colleges to continue supporting them to be able to answer critical questions in public policy. So conversations between universities and government departments and ministries can actually give a very nice pathway for young people to be able to feed evidence and even be able to collect data on behalf of their countries and make sure that you're aligning your efforts to current policy priorities, because it's very easy to be very busy collecting data even when you're working in a certain space. But if it's not aligning to important questions in the policy space, then it's a missed opportunity. So I would urge young people to leverage the opportunities that are there in terms of education and training, and also ask hard questions to their government representatives when they get the opportunity, especially around election cycles.
That's a good recommendation on elections. Shay, how can young
Okay, so that need for education and training can't really be overemphasized. But another thing I will say is for young people to actually leverage existing data. Like there are these hots of data, for instance, in Cameroon, for instance, the National Institute of Statistics collects so much of this data that they mostly collect for specific policy operations. And yet there is really a lot, even policy-wise, that can be achieved using this data. Lots of people really don't take these opportunities to pour into existing data and try to make sense of it in ways that can actually help inform the policy process. Then another thing is there is really a lot of data that has been generated today by our activities. Like young people spend so much time on social media, and a lot of the things they do there, a lot of the conversations, their activities actually have a lot of implications in the policy world. Like there's a lot of, like we mostly think about research, data analysis using classic statistical and econometric techniques. Most people fail to think about opportunities that are available, like for scraping databases, doing a lot of content analysis, and there is really a lot that can be tapped from these additional windows of opportunity that exist, and that now adds to the whole idea of training, that as we increasingly get more and more sophisticated data, especially as we get more, because we increasingly have large databases that contain a lot of information that can be leveraged for policy purposes, but we increasingly have a lot of computational capacity for managing this data and letting it tell interesting stories. Unfortunately, lots of this capacity for doing this type of analysis is not yet integrated into our curriculums in our universities. So I also think that as young people seek to leverage that's to enhance their capacity in these areas, policymakers in the education sector should also look more deeply into like recent developments in analysis and integrate them into training. And I also don't want us to keep thinking about data and analysis in a way that is heavily biased towards statistics. Our repertoire of analytical abilities is even more extended. There is a lot we can gain from ethnographic studies. If you want to solve lots of social policies, for instance, we can't do them using the type of average effects that we mostly get from statistical analysis. So there's a lot we can do from case studies, from ethnographic studies. So if you are a young person interested in evidence-informed decision-making, as I love to call it, you shouldn't be limited, for instance, by your lack of knowledge in statistics. Whatever research capacity you have can actually be helpful in the policy-making process.
Thank you. That's fantastic, Shay. So the next question from our audience, speak to the role of education in improving access to the world of data. What are the specific educational needs, either in your own countries or in general? Diana, do you want to start?
Sure. And I love that Shay mentioned about the need for us not to be obsessed with the statistical side of the conversation. But then as part of that, having that urge to ask critical questions, and not everything is going to be answered by quantitative data, for instance. So there's a lot of increasing interest in mixed methods research, for instance, and I would say that is one of the critical elements of education training for research and evidence generation. I would say we need to build more of that capacity, being able to have stories to go alongside the numbers, the whys, questions or other methodologies that can answer the whys. So we know that X number of people have struggled with a particular problem, but why are they struggling with that particular problem? So I would say investment in mixed methods research, and then also a lot of investment in the translation of evidence into policy. I know most people may look at it from the perspective of it's just simplifying statistics into content that's easily digestible by decision makers, but there are a lot of skills that can be built in terms of aggregating different studies. As Shay mentioned, actually, you don't always have to collect new data to generate evidence. So right now, there's a lot of interest in synthesis of existing evidence and doing meta-analysis and just asking questions from these many studies on a particular problem and being able to distill very specific, actionable policy recommendations. So actually, that's another critical skill of how do you specifically say, this is the problem and this is how decision makers could potentially address this problem. So training in knowledge translation and effective communication of evidence, be it research or simplifying the data. I think I could pause there and let Shay add a little bit on that.
Yeah. Okay. So again, the need for mixed methods training really can't be overemphasized. I don't know how it happens in other countries, but my experience with universities in the continent is that actually at the graduate level, faculties tend to over-focus on the methods that have been traditionally used in that area. So for instance, I did a master's degree in economics, and I had very, very limited training in any form of qualitative analysis. In fact, the things I used to consider to be qualitative analysis were simply quantitative ways of rendering qualitative data. And so I was shut out of a very, very wide and useful research tradition. So I think it is really very important for young researchers to include this in their research training. And also, I think, especially in the area of education, young people need to like expand their opportunities for education beyond the university. There are many more opportunities today for to get informed, especially about analytical methods. With increasing bandwidth in the continent, young people can take advantage of massive online courses. There is Coursera, there is Udacity. There are all these platforms that offer very, very rigorous training on analytical techniques, and the type of techniques that you learn there are really very cutting edge and take advantage of the the latest developments in the field. So I will really encourage young people to take advantage of some of these opportunities for to further develop what they have already learned in school. So while trying to increase the opportunities for expanding research in our universities, I think young people can actually go beyond the walls of our universities to take advantage of the so many learning opportunities out there. So many universities even already provide their courses free of charge online. But even if you want to receive training that is certified, there are opportunities to do that, and some even provide financial aid to actually help you cover the cost of training. So I really urge lots of young people to take advantage of these opportunities.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, what can be done to improve data literacy among non-data focused public servants? Related to that is financing governments on the continent advocate for research science. Shay, do you want to?
Okay. Okay, that's fine. I could go first. And I think especially I'll start responding to the question on funding. I think that was one of the bits I mentioned in my remarks about this over-reliance on overseas funding for us to conduct research. And obviously it has ramifications for us as Africans, because we are not able to define our own research priorities. But I think COVID-19 has really presented a strong window and a really great window, so to speak, for us to urge our governments to allocate more funding to in-country or in-continent research, because that way we are able to respond to at our pace and also respond to very specific problems that are facing us. And what I would say is leveraging on the opportunities that we have, the windows, the opportunities for researchers and decision makers to speak to each other. So most of the times we'll find that decision makers, or rather researchers, want to speak to decision makers when they have evidence to share. We have these policy recommendations to give, but this is the time for us just to go in broadly and say governments need to allocate a significant portion of the national budgets to research in countries. And this advocacy can really go a long way if knowledge intermediaries hold hands with researchers and also get the media into that conversation as well, because COVID has ravaged all of us, whether it's more developed countries, middle income, low income countries. So if we lose this window in terms of advocacy for research funding, I doubt we'll have another similar opportunity. And this advocacy should also be taken to regional levels as well as continental levels. I think the African Union has really tried to step up conversations around evidence that's context specific, that is specific to the needs of African countries. So again, this is also a really, really good window to advocate for funding, even from the African Union perspective. The other question, what was the other question, Meg?
How can non-data specialized public servants without a data background, how can they get more involved? And
I'll plug this closely related to what Shay talked about. These online courses, some of which are really tailored for people who don't have previous background in data, for instance. Like I can talk about some of the courses that JPAL offers via MIT, because we are able to offer some MicroMasters courses that are able to build skills in data analysis, understanding the challenges of poverty and development. So I would say putting these decision makers in that space where they're able to have those courses tailored for them, as well as the organizations which are offering trainings like on evidence-informed decision making. So you're able to bring this very nice package of you need to have a sense of why evidence is useful for decision making. So they do not have like sort of to have boot camp session on data analysis and statistics and everything, but they have like a high level sense of why evidence, the many types of evidence that are there, why they are useful for decision making. And then from there, depending on interest, if they want to go further and gain specific skills in data analysis, for instance, or research writing, or writing systematic reviews, then you would be able to tailor specific capacity enhancement opportunities for them. But I would say start high level on the value of evidence-informed decision making, and then now go lower depending on skill and interest to build more high-level technical skills.
So to just add to that, especially from the funding perspective, so I would say while we increase our efforts to encourage governments to build these research partnerships and to actually develop funding modules for directly engaging researchers in the private sector, it also helps for individual researchers themselves to be proactive in reaching out, either in offering their capacity or sharing results of their previous experience with stakeholders. Like in the past, I've gotten funding from Cameroon's Telecommunications Regulatory Board and from the Ministry of Telecommunications by reaching out directly with research that I was conducting on competition in the telecommunications sector. So I've gotten funding both for conducting research, but also for traveling and presenting papers by reaching out with what I'm doing myself. So what I mostly tell people is that it doesn't hurt actually reaching out and having a conversation. The worst that can happen is a rejection, and that doesn't kill you. That is actually part of the life of a researcher. Rejections are an essential part of it, because I mean, like, even in Western countries, there are so many proposals that never see the light of day. So many proposals are rejected. Even if funding was available and the proposals were called, you still end up putting so much time into something that doesn't see the light of day. But it is also part of the education and training process. It helps at least to enable you know what works and what is necessary. And so reaching out with something you plan to do, and leveraging the experience you already have in trying to sell a research idea. These are informal procedures we can take advantage of as we strive to advocate for more structured avenues for financing research.
Thank you. So a reference to something about research priorities not being set on the continent. Governments rely on data analysis of our lives. Can you tell us about the question of conflict and dig a little bit deeper? How do you break away and define your own research priorities?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and I think it's something that's gaining a lot of interest in countries like in Kenya. There have been big conversations around data privacy and the role that international organizations play when they enter the space and they have this very big funding. So number one, I would say, is citizens taking up that step to actually demand from their governments that our private data should not be sold to other players without our consent. I know there has been conversations around data regulations in Kenya, which is a good thing, because a couple of years ago, data would be collected, and we have all these international organizations having access to citizens' data, but there's not much of a regulation. So I'm happy that amongst a certain level of citizenry, we have some awareness, but I have to be cognizant of the fact that this is not mainstream in terms of knowledge among citizens. So a lot of advocacy is needed because these conversations, you'll find them among people who are on Twitter or on Facebook talking about the data privacy regulations. So there's a lot of work to be done that we can take up that mantle and take it to the grassroots and speak to fellow citizens around demanding better from their leaders to advocate for those data privacy regulations to be passed. So then in terms of what can be done to ensure that what's coming, the assistance that's coming from abroad, making sure that the agreements around research are very collaborative. I love it that some of the government agencies we've been working with ask a lot of questions in terms of how will this evidence be used? How are we able to participate in defining the research questions and all that? So being aware about that this is a level, we need to level the playing field. The playing field has not been leveled for a long time, but making sure that governments are able now to occupy space because they're the representatives of citizens in terms of negotiating those collaborations. So it needs a lot of awareness among our government agencies, as well as seeking accountability from our ministries. So again, parliaments in Africa stepping up and making sure they're asking tough questions and making sure that citizens are not being compromised in these partnerships between African governments and organizations on other continents, especially from the North.
Thank you, Diana. Shay?
Okay, so I wish I actually had a very perfect answer for the question about setting our priorities, because of course with the significant paucity of funding for research in the continent, I mean, it is easy to understand why our research agenda is easily set either by the priorities set by available or existing funding. I mean, like it really limits our capacity. I think what I can only fall back to is that we define our research interests based on the policy needs that we identify, and then to the extent that we can market this locally and increase our research profile, because I think a strong research profile back home earns the respectability abroad that can maybe help us define our research priorities. That's the way I can think about that for now.
Thank you. So we have just a little bit of time left and a couple of questions to cover. So I'm going to try and say them all so that you all can react to them. So the first is, what is the role that YALI specifically can play in the research and improve public management and governance? And then a question about whether data is currency. So can you address that? And then what to improve Southern University students who have limited access to published papers, even when field research was carried out on the continent. So what can YALI do? Is data currency? And how access for those who have limited access to published papers, and even when field research was carried out there?
Let's start quickly about the YALI question, and saying that the kind of training we get in YALI, it's a great springboard for you to be able to get into the public management space and ask those difficult questions. And I would say YALI fellows, it would be a great opportunity for them to actually step into the space and not feel that the opportunities need to be created for them. I've heard somebody say in a previous discussion that don't wait to be given a seat at the table, just grab a seat and bring yourself to the table. So occupy the space, whether it's in opportunities to feed back into policies. We always have a lot of public participation opportunities. YALI fellows can put themselves in that space. I'm glad that in Kenya, alumni were able to put around some memoranda towards the COVID response in Kenya. So taking advantage of those opportunities, be it in the legislature as well as in government ministries. And then, sorry, what was the other question?
So is data currency, and then how do we improve access for those who don't have access to publications?
Yes, I would say data is currency. Data is being collected every other day from our points of engagement, whether you're going for a service in a government facility, our smartphones are generating a lot of data. So it is currency, and how this is used is now what matters. How do governments harness the data that they are collecting from citizens? And again, issues of privacy here are very strong. So this is very murky ground. But I would say if it is well used and well managed, it can really help answer critical questions. For instance, in terms of service delivery, you're able to tell which areas are underserved, and that way you're able to allocate resources as needed. So it's definitely currency and can really help governments be able to invest where citizens will access public goods very fast. And the final question about Southern researchers being able to get an opportunity to publish. I would say, again, this is a challenging space, which it's great for us to continue pushing the boundary in terms of equal collaboration with researchers from the North, and being able to put your efforts in publishing high quality papers, and also put yourself out there to do fast author publications. And partnerships generate a lot of value, but also do not be scared of taking the leadership in terms of defining a research publication that you want to publish in. And target open access. I'm all for open access publishing, and I think there are lots of opportunities for us as African upcoming scholars and experts in the development space.
So what I can quickly say about research, especially accessing research results, is I think we really need to, because much of the problem is that a lot of high quality research is hidden behind paywalls, and lots of times when you are trying to access journals with your own publications, editors tend to care a lot about where you are quoting from. So I think we really need to encourage our universities, our libraries. We need to advocate for them to subscribe to these libraries, have these subscriptions that give students access. We used to have it in my university where I was, but then it was discontinued and it was a big problem for me. And my approach to solving this problem was mostly to identify the types of content I wanted to access, and then cold contacting authors. It's very, very easy for authors to give you access, at least to they can give you versions to access to earlier versions of the paper. Some authors actually publish make their papers available on their personal websites. But yeah, I think it's a bit more difficult for us in the continent. But when you are very determined, you can always have access. Maybe not as quickly as those who have access to a library. But I think that's actually a pertinent issue we could spend more time talking about.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for the conversation at the beginning, and thank you to YALI for thinking of this panel. It's so important going forward. We are going to conclude this session, and we look forward to the next panel.